Haere mai, talofa lava bem-vindo. Welcome to Navigating a Cultural Queer Identities Journey, where I share experiences, challenges, and possibilities that exist for gender, sexuality, and relationships diverse, or GSRD people and clients who identify with more than one cultural identity. Cultural identities are nuanced, complex, and not plain sailing. My personal identities journey began over 20 years ago when asked by Maori tangata whenua, or people of this land in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Ko waiau, who am I? My parents left Madeira Islands in 1969 for Scotland in search of a better life for them and us. My proud Madeirense people of Madeira parents would refer to my siblings and I, all born in Scotland, as Scottish. At that time, assimilation and homogenisation were greatly encouraged for immigrants and foreigners to do. Growing up, my siblings and I experienced frequent racism and exoticization, making it hard to express Madeirense cultural identity outside our home. Discrimination led to rejecting Madeirense identity and privileging Scottish identity. Experiences of racism added to marginalisation and sowed the seeds for internalised depression and identity shame. As a youngster, racism took me away from my parents' cultural identity and therefore an important part of understanding ko waiau, who am I? Tracy McIntosh, 2007, affirms the privileging of one ethnicity over another is due to a complex mixture of family dynamics and personal histories, as well as to prevalent societal views of ethnic identities. McIntosh explores Maori identity politics in a particular relationship to marginalisation and describes what she deems as fixed, fluid fusion, and forced identities. Fixed identity is described as living traditional roles, genealogical expectations, and social mores of Te Ao Māori or Māori worldview. Fluid fusion is described as a more relaxed, slight challenge to the traditional fixed identity, influenced by the impacts of marginalisation. I tend to think of fluid fusion as movement enabling the blending of the old traditional ways and new urban ways identities can coexist. Forced identities are formed by inequities which are stigmatizing or marginalizing identities forced onto individuals by outsiders. For example, sexuality descriptors, mental illness, disability, etc. Examples of forced cultural identities are foreigner, immigrant, a migrant, or emigrant. Taking fluid fusion identities further, I will now share respondents' findings from a diversity questionnaire from two cultures, Madeira, Portugal, and Samoa in the Pacific Islands. Just to be clear, I am no expert in all things Far Samoa or Madeirense. But firstly, some queer context on the islands. Madeira Islands has currently no official census stats gathered on GSRD populations. However, since marriage equality passed in 2010, there have been 123 same-sex marriages recorded on the island. Madeira Pride is going into its 5th year. Speaking with Paulo from Opus Gay, there has been much progress on the island, especially Funchal, the capital. There is still a long way to go, especially in rural areas of Madeira. Now to Samoa. Samoa Islands are situated in the Pacific Ocean. I'm unaware of Samoan GSRD population stats gathered there. Same-sex sexual acts are illegal and still open to prosecution, up to 7 years imprisonment, but the law is not enforced. Fa'afafine, way of female, and fa'afatama, way of male, are post-colonial terms, McMullen 2018. These are considered as third and fourth gender identities representing fluidity and fulfilling contextually acceptable roles in Samoan society. SFA, or Samoa Fa'afafine Association, is actively involved in bettering the lives of Fa'afafine on the island. From the book Samoan Queer Lives, Tola Papa, McMullen, and Kihara 2018, Kihara says many of the contributors they spoke to still face discrimination for being queer, including conflicts with their church and family. She says she's an advocate for the word Fa'afafine, though she doesn't impose it on anyone, partly because the words transgender and homosexual come from Western disease models and diagnostics. She's also supportive but wary of Western pride movements, such as the rainbow flag. Her concern is that it might be used as a conduit to impose or promote Western LGBTQI values over Indigenous ones. Madeira and Samoan definitions of culture centre around the traditionally fixed social systems, customs and traditions that support collectivist family identity and spiritual religious realms. Language is at the heart of cultural identity. For example, Portuguese language follows a binarist model where everything, including named objects, is either masculine or feminine. For example, amigo or amiga for friend. This makes it particularly difficult for explaining, for example, não-binário or non-binary identity. How about amigo? The word shame is another cultural language difference. Shame, maatsiasi in Samoan, or vergonha in Portuguese, transliterates more in a collectivist sense, understanding that shame does not belong solely to the individual experience of feeling shame, but also that of carrying or bringing shame on the wider family. Is there an identity that better captures the combination of diverse cultural backgrounds and GSRD identities? Here are some Western diverse cultural terms on offer. There's third culture kid or 3CK or adult 3CK, or diasporic cultural identity, or hybrid cultural identity, or cross-cultural kid CCKs, or ambicultural, meaning both and around. Now to the research findings from 6 GSRD and culturally diverse participants sharing their experiences and thoughts on the counselling experience. The participants were aged between 21 and 51 years old. 3 participants identify as Portuguese, with 2 having one parent born in Portugal, the mainland, and the other parent born outside Portugal. Now to Samoa, 2 were born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to parents born in Samoa. 1 was born in Australia with 1 Indigenous Maori parent and a Cook Island Maori parent. The participants identified as cis female, non-binary, queer, akitani, takatapui, lesbian, pansexual, bi, gay, queer, married, partnered, single, and poly. In response to the question, a name they would give to their cultural, sexuality, and gender identities. 1, New Zealand made Samoan. People learn about me being lesbian by getting to know me more, or moana queer or fafa, or takatapu and or bi akitane, or gay queer, or queer Portuguese woman and cross-cultural queer, and lastly, Portuguese lesbian. And the responses to the question, what book title would you give that depicts your culture and sexuality, gender identity? The responses were A Rainbow Coconut, Tales from a New Zealand-Made Samoan, or Memoirs of a Moana Millennial, Voyages in a Virtual Vastscape, or A Brown Boy's Paradise, or In Search for a Better Life, Crossing to the Enemy's Territory, Spain to Portugal, and lastly, Finding Myself Across the Globe. Now to their experiences of counselling. 3 out of 6 participants recorded having been to a counsellor. Only 1 out of 3 stated they would return to the same counsellor for support. Issues related to their counselling experience were as follows. The biggest issue was that none of the counsellors I've seen has been able to navigate both culture and queerness, which was exactly the reason I'd sought counselling support. Instead, I've been met with, wow, that seems like a lot, which has never been helpful. Every single time I left counselling, I avoided all follow-up with them, opting to find self-management and community care pathways. Another response, yes, it was useful having that counselling and therapy service with people I've seen because they've either been queer, brown, or both, which made things easier when discussing things and working through them. What would be important for counsellors to know? Here are the responses. I think embedded support structures that utilise talking therapy skills as an extra tool are much more useful for queer, trans, intersex Pacifica folks. I'm a big believer in the idea that we need to go through a process of embodiment and somatic healing practice, something that tends to live in our Indigenous knowledge systems. Don't assume you know my cultural paradigm. Don't assume you understand my sexuality and gender identity, especially when those assumptions are only labels I use. Don't use me as your teacher. Do some decent reflection on your biases and privileges, etc. I don't need your cishet white tears. Just treat me like a normal human rather than some weird anomaly. Another response, I think it's really helpful when the service provider understands the dimensions of people's identities and how these facets can interact with each other to impact lives differently. Clients definitely would get more from providers if intersectionality is considered and respected, or probably for the council to be part of the LGBTQA plus community, as they would easily relate to some of the issues. Lastly, to not invalidate the immigrant experience. It's a pretty huge thing and can often be a traumatic process to undergo. These responses affirm that diversity exists in gender, sexuality, and relationships, cultural identities. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to cultural identity. In other words, culture and GSRD are not fixed identities. One important finding is how challenging it is for GSRD folks to safely explore their cultural intersections. One therapeutic framework I believe that can support clients in exploring diverse cultural and GSRD identities is relational cultural theory, or RCT, founded in the US by Jean Miller, who wrote a best-selling book in 1976 titled Toward a New Psychology of Women. The main focus is on relationships. One core aspect is what Miller calls central relational paradox, or CRP, which presumes that we all have a natural drive towards relationship, and in these relationships we long for acceptance. The primary goal is to create and maintain mutually growth-fostering relationships based on which both parties feel that they matter. A critical step in the evolution of the model was recognizing the significance of cultural context to human development and the impact of culture on daily life. Through exploring connection and disconnection at both individual and social levels, we begin to understand how the political becomes psychological, personal, and vice versa. The RCT framework advocates that to grow a greater felt sense of self, Mells and Frey 2014, relationship needs to be achieved through authentic, equitable, and meaningful connections with others, and that where relationships matter, prepare for disconnections to occur. And when disconnections are managed largely through empathy, can lead to an even deeper reconnection that in turn strengthens the relationship. In summary, the main takeaways are: understand that culture, ethnic, gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity can be an intertwined relationship and not just separate entities. Respecting GSRD differences and cultural pluralism may underpin how relationships and connections occur. Cultural and GSRD identity definitions belong first and foremost to the person and are contextual. Ask, don't assume. Identities work can be political, and using McIntosh's fixed fluid fusion and/or forced framework may be useful to the client in exploring inner identities, nuances, and conflicts. And just like GSRD identities, contemporary cultural identities can occur along a reflexive continuum. Cultural identities can be fluid, around and intertwined, rather than thinking fixed and static, for example, diasporic or ambicultural. And cultural and GSRD identities develop over time as a person grows in and with authentic relationship and connection to the self, others, their family, chosen family, partner, partners, and wider communities. So, ko waiau, who am I? Ko Anny da Silva Freitas, na proud ambicultural Madeirense Scottish, now binario, lesbica, toko ingoa. This brings us to the Karakia, a blessing taonga gifted by Jay Barclay to the queer youth organisation Inside Out. Lastly, references and resources. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, katoa.